My guest today is former forensic psychologist and prison governor turned leadership coach, Saj Zafar, and she joins me now. Saj, welcome to The Ladder. Great to have you in the studio. I want to take you a long way away to Kashmir, a remote village where you were born before your parents brought you to South Yorkshire in the 70s when you were just a baby. Obviously, you won't remember that journey, but tell us about how the family dynamic changed, how your life changed when you came to England.
So it's the typical story of the first migrants, the South Asian heritage that came to this country. So my father came as a labourer. And he ended up in South Yorkshire, and that's where he was working. And then I think a few years later, he invited my mum and me to join him. So we travelled and we came to a small mining town, and there were no other Asian families there.
And as I understand it, they couldn't read or write terribly
Absolutely
well.
not. No, both were literate and educated.
And do you remember, what's your earliest memory of that? Being different, looking different, feeling different?
So my life was pretty uneventful until I turned up at school. And I'll never forget my first day at school. I was probably around 5 years old, and Mum took me and she dropped me off. She pushed me inside the gate, and bless her, she'd taken the time to dress me up in this very colourful garments, that's all I can say, with lots of coal in my eyes. She greased up the hair, and I must have been wrenching from curry smell. And so imagine, in that form, she put me into the playground with all the other children and then disappeared. And that's when I first realised that she put me into a space where nobody looked like me. And I couldn't speak a word of English because Mum would have been talking to me in the mother tongue, which is Punjabi. And the teachers came to get me, and it was just downhill. I remember that one of the children pushed me. This was in the early days. All they saw was this very disruptive, and that's the label I got, disruptive child that was always distracted, that wasn't fitting in. And soon, then I started to use my fists, and I think I reverted because I couldn't speak. My early years, I was literally on mute.
You've said in the past that you learnt to fight before you could write.
Yes. Parents would be called in, and I guess the teachers would try to communicate with them, and then I would get home, and then I would encounter a beating. I was very tomboyish. I wasn't pink and fluffy. I wasn't delicate. And all I was interested was in playing, climbing trees, going out with the boys on where we lived, playing football, cricket.
You didn't fit in at home. You didn't fit in at school either.
No.
So paint a picture of what Saj the teenager was like.
Very lonely. Very, very lonely. And the word that comes to mind, fractured, I think. I learnt very early on that the only ticket out of the life that I was born into was education. So I was very, very determined. But the backlash of that was the school had no hope in me.
Well, when you were 15, your parents told you that you were engaged to a cousin in Pakistan. So that was indeed the destiny that they'd set for you, an arranged marriage.
Absolutely.
How did you react to that? Do you remember that?
They didn't tell me. I came home and my older sister told me, and we were bickering, or typical sibling sort of stuff. And within that conversation, she dropped it in, and she shouted at me, and she said she hated me, and she said it was good that I was going to get married and be taken to Pakistan. And I felt that somebody had just punched me in the stomach. Mum ran into the room and said, "What's happening?" And I said, "She's just said that I'm going to get married to somebody in Pakistan. And, it's a lie." And my mum just smiled and she said, "No, it's not a lie." So I just had a massive meltdown. I ended up crying. And then I went on hunger strike for 3 weeks.
3 weeks?
For 3 weeks. In the hope that they would change their mind, and they didn't. I remember the conversations my mother was having with me, and they were around the fact that there are only 2 ways that you can leave. One is marriage, and the other is death. And that's why I thought, well, I'm not going to go through with the marriage, so the only way out is death. So I made an assessment. I was 15 years old. I'd spoken to my career a teacher, and I said, you need to help me with the GCSEs. I said, I need to pass those. And he just sneered at me and he said, you'll not amount to anything, so I'm not even going to waste my time with you. And I remember I came home that evening. It was summer, and that's when I decided to take the overdose.
So tell us what happened next.
Clearly, somewhere in my psychology, I'd read that if you take an overdose, you die. I hadn't processed the in-between phase, so I took everything that I could find from my mum's cupboard, and I just took them all. And I sat on the edge of my bed, and I remember tears were falling down, and I was thinking, why am I not dying? And next thing I knew, the room started to spin, and that's when I started to throw up, and that's when my mum found me on the bathroom floor, just throwing up, and she quickly called for the ambulance. And I'll never forget, I was being blue lighted, and there was a lovely paramedic, and she looked at me, she smiled, she was holding my hand, and I was just crying, and she sort of said, it's okay, you're going to be all right. And those were the worst words that she could have said to me, because that meant that I'd failed. When they rushed me into hospital, I had my stomach pumped out, I was laid up in bed, and the nurses, I'll never forget the amazing nurses, they just rallied around me, and, somebody was looking at my hair and, giving me cream for my face. They were giving me attention that I was not accustomed to. And so then they took me to see a psychiatrist because the police were involved as to why I'd taken an overdose. And I immediately thought that this woman is going to rescue me. So I just laid out my heart, told her every single thing about my so-called life. And she peered over her glasses and she was making lots of notes, which gave me some kind of assurance that she was taking me seriously. Shortly after, my parents came into the room and she told them that there was absolutely nothing wrong with me and I was having an identity crisis. My father's interpretation of that was, okay, so what you're telling us that we need to reprogram her or get her to understand and process the fact that she's a Pakistani girl. So that led to a one-way ticket to Pakistan. And I'll never forget, my grandmother just looked at me very disappointingly and actually told my father off, and she said, what have you done with her? She just is not what a young woman should be. And my father said, well, I've brought her here to leave her here so that you can train her. So basically, I became the home help. My routine started at 5 o'clock in the morning. As soon as dawn broke, my routine was to make breakfast for everybody, wash up, and we were talking about cooking on an open fire. Which was a skill that I had to master. And one evening, I overheard my grandmother tell my uncle that my mother was in Pakistan. And I didn't know this.
So when you heard your mum was in Pakistan, how did you respond to that? What happened next?
Oh my God, it was one of the most bravest things that I've done. And that particular day, it was my school day. So every week I was allowed to go to school. But I remembered that when I was little, Mum used to write letters or get me to write her letters to her mother. And I remembered the address that we used to post. So literally, I recalled the address in my head. And I went to the bus stop. And I asked a few people that I needed to go to this village, and they said it was about 6 hours away. And I was very, very mindful that I was a young girl travelling by myself, and that's a no-no in Pakistan. So what I did, I attached myself to this old lady. So I sat with her, followed her around, and I travelled for 6 hours to this village, reached this village, and through the fields, managed to navigate to the house. And it was mid-afternoon. I was hungry, I was thirsty, but I was super, super excited that I walked into and it was a small sort of house with a forecourt, and there was a bed outside, and she was lying in the sun and she was half dozing, I think. And I went and I sat at her feet. I was so emotional, I just couldn't speak. And she got up and she just looked at me, and the shock on her face was like, oh my God, what have you done? And, and I started crying and stumbling my words. And she just pushed me away. And she said, you need to go back before they've discovered that you're missing. And I thought, no. And I think something died in me that day.
How did you survive that?
I didn't. I just went back. I got into trouble and then they put more sanctions on me. And then luck would have it that she made an unannounced visit. As she was coming through the gate, she saw me with my uncle who sat in the front veranda, and he was shouting at me and he was asking me to clean the drains, and I refused, saying that I didn't want to get my hands dirty. And then he said I needed to find a way to clean the drains, and I just knew that it was sewage. And I was cleaning out the drains, and my mum saw that. And then she made herself visible, and my uncle was kind of embarrassed. And then she didn't say anything. And that night when we were sleeping, she got me up in the middle of the night and she whispered in my ear and she said, "Where's your bag?" She goes, "Put your clothes in. We're going to leave." I just jumped out of bed. I don't even think I packed anything. And it's that moment that I'd been waiting for. And she did. And we crept out of the house. And as we got to the front gate, my uncle woke up and he literally started shouting. The lights came on. And he said to my mother, "If you leave, I will kill you and I'll kill her." And my mother just stood in front of me. I think that's the only time that she's ever done that for me.
More from my ladder guest this week, former forensic psychologist and prison governor turned leadership coach Saj Zafar, in just a second. Welcome back to the ladder with former forensic psychologist and prison governor turned leadership coach Saj Zafar. She's about to tell me about her journey up the ladder. So you came back to England after, a hugely traumatic childhood. An extraordinary story you've just told us. How did you persuade your parents to let you go to university?
So by now, I was becoming a little bit more savvy. So I negotiated and I said, I will agree to marry and have an arranged marriage. And this is the deal. You send me to university. I will stay at home. I'll travel each day. You'll allow me to resume my education. I will get a degree. The day I graduate, the day I finish university, that is the day you can set the wedding and I will get married. And that's what we negotiated.
So it was a kind of Faustian pact, really, a deal
Absolutely.
with the devil.
And yeah. I complied. I became the role model daughter that they were looking for. And I knew that at the end of that period, I would be gone. On the last day of my university, I ran away. And it occurred to me one day, I think 6 weeks in, that this wasn't what I had set myself to do. The whole point of running away was to live a life of freedom. So I thought, oh no, I need to come out of hiding and I need to speak to my parents and I need them to let me go. And that's when I contacted my parents and invited my father to meet me in a cafe in Birmingham.
And what happened at that meeting?
I went to that cafe knowing that I was going to risk. I was taking a massive risk and it could go horribly wrong. I knew that he wouldn't come alone. I knew that he would come with all, uncles and cousins, all the males. And I knew that the drill would be to grab me and get me into the car or either drive me to the airport or set light to me or kill me or whatever.
So you knew walking into the cafe that you were risking your life?
Yes.
In exchange for the possible chance of freedom?
Yeah. And that is the day that my father came through for me. And we sat in the cafe and he started off, asking me why I'd brought so much shame to the family. And I just sat there listening. And then he paused and he asked me why. And I just looked at him and I said, "Dad, I just want my freedom." And he said, "What does freedom mean?" I said, "I just want to get a job." I said, "I want to travel." And he said, "But that's not what our girls do." And I said, "I know, Dad, but that's what I want to do." And he just looked at me and he said to me, "Is there a back door here?" And I said, "I don't know." He said, "If I were you, I'd find it." And he goes, "I'd suggest that you run and you never look back." And he said, "I will deal with the family and I will deal with the community. But you can go. You've got my blessing." And that's the day he let me go.
You found the back door of the cafe?
I did, and I ran, and I ran, and I never looked back.
And you've never seen your...
No, once I settled in London, I got my job as a forensic psychologist. I was doing really, really well. And I kept in touch with my father. And then he invited me to go home And we went on to have a really brilliant relationship.
And that was the point at which you kind of set yourself on, we talk about this lot's called the ladder, you set yourself on the bottom rung of the ladder. You got a position at Feltham Young Offenders Institute to help set up the first therapeutic unit for young sex offenders. I mean, that is a hugely challenging first job, isn't it?
It is, but it's where my heart is. I think when you've had so much trauma and trouble in your own life, as cliched as it sounds, I believe that I was put on this earth to make a difference to people's lives. And the worse they are, the worse circumstances they're in, better for me. That's where I thrive.
Well, you climbed the ladder to the very top. You were the first female Asian Muslim governor at HMP Wormwood Scrubs.
I was.
I mean, incredible achievement. I'm going to get there in a second, but take us the biggest challenges along the way. What would you highlight?
I knew I wasn't smart. And for me, it was always about doing the right thing and making sure whatever I did, I gave it not 100%, but 200%. And that brought me to the attention of senior leaders who then, I guess, saw some potential in me. And, and they put me through for the leadership program. And when I went for the leadership program, again, I didn't think I was going to get in, and I did. And I passed, I graduated, and we were given brown envelopes. And we were given the brown envelope with a caveat that the prisons that we have selected for you as graduates or prisons that are low category, everybody opened their envelopes and there was a huge sigh of relief. And then I opened mine. I have to confess, I thought it was a candid camera moment. And I thought, oh, okay, because I'm the youngest and, they constantly do this, they wind me up. And so I read the name and the Director General happened to be standing in front of me, for the photographs and the handshake. And he whispered and he said, is everything okay, Saj? And I said, yeah, it says Wormwood Scrubs. And he went, yes, that's your prison.
Explain why Wormwood Scrubs had such a reputation.
I mean, it was the most notorious prison in the world.
So you've been handed this absolute bum deal, basically.
Exactly. And their reasoning for that was because you live in London, so that's where the need is and that's where you're going to have to go. Somebody asked me once, they said, oh, what have your challenges been? And I said, young Asian female. The very things that, that got me there. And I remember reporting in for duty and the officer behind the window, without even bothering to look up, he just pointed to the other door and said, social workers, probation officers, solicitors, lawyers, they need to go to the other side. And I looked at him and said, no, sir, I'm here to report for duty. And then he went this beetroot red and he sort of mumbled an apology. And he says, and then he looked over to the other officer and he said, you're not going to believe this. This is the new governor. So,
I mean, it's funny, but it's awful.
Yeah. I mean, and I just knew there and then that, there'd been a big celebration around my appointment and everything. And I thought, no. Now what I had to do was to land. And the thing about prisons, you need that comradeship. You need to have that sense of belonging. So I just knew I had to work damn hard to get accepted. And I didn't. It was horrendously difficult in the early days.
Racism, misogyny?
Everything. And I was young. I was attractive, I was single, and I couldn't get beyond what you're doing after work. Do you fancy going out for a drink? And then there was a lot of rumours, who was going to be able to sleep with me. And I remember that every day when I would go home, I would shower because I felt dirty. And then I started to very, very quickly edit myself. So I developed what I call a look. So I started to wear trouser suits. I wore roll neck jumpers. There was no cleavage. There was nothing. I wore flat shoes. Nothing that would suggest that I was a woman.
I mean, you've obviously experienced from within the many challenges that prisons are facing. And, we've had a reminder of that really recently with the Times story that convicted criminals are going to be temporarily spared jail because they're full up in England and Wales. I mean, when you read that story, with your knowledge of the service, what did you think? What needs to change here?
Prisons don't work. That is the bottom line. and we just contain. If anybody asks, what is the role of the prison governor? The role of the prison governor is to preserve life. There is only a small percentage of prisoners that will go on to commit heinous crimes that, should be looking at long term or never being able to come out of prison. But in the majority, what we're looking at is society's social problems. So most of the prisoners that you will find are not because they are a danger to society, because they've got mental health problems, because they've got drug issues, because they can't find jobs, because they were expelled from schools and they've spiraled into those spaces and made crime as a career. So for me, when I read that story, it's where we consistently end up. And
you deal with the root cause.
Yeah, and we don't deal with the root cause. We panic, and the fact that we're building more prisons, what is that saying? It's like we're fueling, the problem rather than solving the problem.
Well, you now solve problems in your life as a leadership coach, setting up the Leadhership Academy for women. Tell us how your previous experiences have fed into what you do now.
5 years ago, I had a health scare, which led me to reevaluate my life. And whilst I enjoyed my leadership journey, despite the challenges, I felt that I'd been afforded a very unique experience, probably not experienced by many women, especially women of colour. And I was mindful that towards the end, that I was in rooms as the only woman, but more importantly, as a South Asian woman.
This was still in the prison service?
Yes. Yeah. And so I became mindful that, that one of the things that I always consistently did was to pave the way for the women coming up behind me. And I thought to myself, if God was going to give me another chance, which he did, and if I was going to recover from my health scare, that I would happily dedicate my life to doing that. And so I resigned after 22 years and set up my coaching business. And today, I guess, if I strip it back, I am that one woman that was never there for me.
You're listening to The Ladder with Cathy Newman on Times Radio. My guest this week, former forensic psychologist and prison governor turned leadership coach, Saj Zafar, who's about to give her advice for those wanting to follow her up the ladder. So I wonder what advice you would give to someone listening who is facing a difficult period in their life, maybe an arranged marriage, domestic violence, whatever that may be. What advice would you give to someone to survive that situation and end up in a safer place?
The first thing is that you have to believe that you have a choice. Many of us believe that we don't have a choice. I believe that once you believe that you have a choice, that's the mind shift that's needed. And then everything else will follow. You don't need to have massive plans. This is what I teach. You don't even need to know where you're going, as long as you know what you are going to leave. And that's the first step. You have to decide that I don't want this, you don't want to settle for this, so therefore you want to go on.
Saj Zafar, it's been a real privilege to hear about your journey up the ladder.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
That was Saj Zafar. You can find out more about her coaching by searching for Leadhership Academy. My producer this week was Emily Leahy. My technical operator was James Blake. Coming up next on Times Radio, it's Hannah McInnes in for Ed Vasey.